On today's podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Perry Bulwer. Perry grew up in Port Alberni, a mill town on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. In 1972, at 16 years of age, he dropped out of high school to run away with the Children of God, one of a number of millennial Christian cults that sprang up in the 1960s and 70s. Perry escaped the cult's tight control in 1991 while living in Asia. Through education, Bulwer lost his religion, turning from religious extremist to secular humanist lawyer, fighting for the rights of sex workers and drug users living on the streets of Vancouver. Haunted by his own past, Bulwer became an advocate for thousands of second-generation survivors of the cult's child abuse and psychological trauma scattered around the world. I speak today with Perry about his book, Misguided, My Jesus Freak Life in a Doomsday Cult. It is part memoir and part exposé of the Children of God. Perry describes what first attracted him to the cult and why he stayed in it for nearly 20 years. And then Perry recounts the lasting damage from his time in the Children of God to himself and especially to those born into it. I bring you my conversation with Perry Bulwer. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Perry Bulwer, thank you for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Yeah, glad to be here.
I'm going to talk to you about your autobiography, Misguided, and I think that it'll become clear why I want to talk to you when I read the subtitle. It's My Jesus Freak Life in a Doomsday Cult. And I've got a lot of questions for you about the cult and so on, but I want to start kind of at the beginning. I've had a couple of guests on Podcast for Inquiry who were born into fundamentalist or evangelical or even cult households, but that wasn't the case for you. You from your account, you had a pretty standard household. So can you just tell us of what your life was like before you got into the Jesus freak cult, and then we'll get into that at that
Yeah,
point.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I had as you say, pretty normal, average upbringing in a small mill town, my hometown on Vancouver Island. Uh, it's a forest industry town, um, small, maybe 20,000 people. So I grew up here in the 60s. My mother raised me as a Catholic, which is kind of an important detail. My father did not attend mass with us. In fact, he never, to this day, I still don't know what his beliefs were. Religion was sort of like, I think he just generally believed in God, but he wasn't a Catholic. He didn't come to church. He never talked to me about religion. So I basically, as I said, I was raised a Catholic, went through all the rituals as a child. And I was actually quite into it. When I was about 10 years old, I actually became an altar boy, and took lessons to learn in those days, the mass was in Latin. So I'd memorize some Latin phrases for the mass, etc. Um, and, but then as I got into my teens, again, this is the 60s. So there was a lot of the cultural influences of the counterculture, the hippies, the summer of love, the psychedelia, through the music. My first album was Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles, so
Oh,
all of those had influences on me, right? And I was as I was probably about 13, 14, getting disillusioned with the church. Um, like teens as a stereotype are generally, very self-righteous and
right.
can pull.
rebel against
Yeah,
what their parents or whatever is deemed standard by the authorities or
yeah,
by the adults.
exactly. So I stopped going to church, but I was still getting religious influences through the culture. Like I'd watch a lot of Bible movies or, movies based on the Bible. Probably the biggest influence was George Harrison. His triple album, All Things Must Pass. Every song on there is a spiritual song. And,
Hmm.
and there was even a song in there in the lyrics, you don't need a church. He would refer to Jesus in his lyrics. Um, and so that was sort of feeding my spiritual need, this my desire. So although I stopped going to church, I still was a believer. I believed in God. And so that's sort of the setup to where the cult comes into my life at age 16. But just another detail is that, again, growing up in this mill town, it was like this was the only option for me, was working in the industry. My dad worked in the pulp mill. My aunts and uncles, including my mom, had worked in the plywoods or mills, sawmills in the forest. And that was kind of like the only option I could see. And although I turned out to be intelligent, I didn't know it at the time. So I never thought of education or higher education as an option. So I was in this sort of, the summer of love and teen runaways and all of that's going on in the background. And I have all this sort of teen angst about my future and what I'm going to do and what are the options. And I really dreaded the idea of following my dad's footsteps into the mill. So I was sort of in this odd space.
So, I mean, it sounds to me like it's a pretty standard small town, one industry
Yep.
uh, town where the teenager doesn't necessarily want to follow in their parents' footsteps. You've got exposed to all the same cultural influences as everyone else, despite it being a small town,
Yep.
and not seeing a lot of options. I mean, I've heard that story, and I've read that story, and I've seen that story in movies, a hundred times.
Yep.
But then you encountered. Tell us about how you found, or how the cult found you, or how you found the cult, and like tell us their name and a bit about it. And what I'm particularly interested in is what attracted it to you. What made it attractive to you that you decided to join.
Sure. And so part of the answer to that last question you posed is a year before I met them. So the summer when I was 15, I went with his classmate. We hitchhiked to California. So, two 15-year-olds
Yeah.
um, from a small town on the west coast of Canada hitchhiked all the way to California. The goal was to go to Disneyland, but which was my friend's goal, and he had relatives down there. But I had this wanderlust. I really wanted to travel and see the world. I was the first generation to grow up in front of the television. That brought the world to me. And I really wanted to see the world basically and not get stuck in my town. So we do this summer epic, hitchhiking trip. And there's an interesting anecdote I tell in the story how I did get picked up. We got picked up by some Jesus freaks down in Northern California. Um, and if I had been alone, I probably would have gone with them. But my friend wasn't interested. So anyway, I come back to Canada. I'm now 16. I had a few experiences on that California trip with LSD. I interpreted some of the hallucinations. I interpreted it with my religious beliefs, thinking it was sort of I was glimpsing the spirit world. So in that setting, I'm back in my hometown and sort of estranged from my friends I was hanging out with, sitting in a coffee shop when a stranger walks in and sits down beside me. I was at a counter and starts preaching to me. He had, just basic Christian message. And it lasted about 5 minutes. He left some tracts with me. But about I was still there about maybe half an hour later. I guess something about me had caught his attention because he came back with a colleague, and we spent the next 2, 3, 4 hours until the place shut down with them just preaching this gospel message. They didn't tell me too much about who they were, other than that they were called the Children of God, and they had a small commune in town. Um, Nothing about the greater organization. It was, they didn't get into that too much. It was basically a real basic gospel message. And I think they were, because of my Catholic indoctrination, I had the basic dogma, although I'd never read the Bible. And Catholics
Hmm.
aren't keen on reading the Bible itself. Like that's that's the business of priests. But I'd never read the Bible, but I mean, I had a basic understanding. And so these, what I now call cult recruiters, were picking up on that, and they saw something in me that they would have referred to me as a sheep, somebody who was sheepy, uh, interested in following, the shepherd, so to speak, right? So to use their cult terminology. So I ended up, through that first meeting, maybe a week or two later, actually visiting their commune, and I got really into it. So I'd go, this happened very quickly. Well, the first visit at their home, actually, I should mention, they sort of spiritually coerced me into saying what's commonly referred to as the Lord, the salvation prayer. As a Catholic, this concept of born again is a different, and I didn't even understand that terminology. It's a different concept in the Catholic dogma. The Children of God, a Protestant group, to them, being born again was the only way to be saved. You had to say this little salvation prayer. And I was a bit confused over that, which is why I say they spiritually coerced me. Whether I had some kind of epiphany or whatever, I don't know, but I was really, really attracted to these people and their message. So every night after school, I'd go to their place for hours on the weekends, spending all my time. And I was hooked. Within just weeks, I was really, and going back to what attracted to me, a basic part of their message and explaining why they were there in our small hometown was the you know the sort of the command, the basic Christian command to go into all the world and preach the gospel. This evangelism,
Hmm.
that we had to go into all the world and spread this message before Jesus could come back. And that, even aside from the religious side of it, this idea that, wow, I could follow these people and go anywhere in the world, that was a big appeal. You know,
Right. So it sort of drew on both your Catholic upbringing, like all those hooks that were in
yeah,
there from the beginning, and appealed to your wanderlust. It was a way out of the town that you grew up in, that you didn't see another way out. So
right.
okay.
Yeah, and also they were an alternative to the church system. So what a big part of their message then was, we're dropping out not just from society but from the church system, because the church system has failed according to them, and
Hmm.
we are the new era of Christians. We're going to live like the first Christians did, and just leave everything, follow Jesus, and go into all the world and preach the gospel. And so it was like an alternative. It was a way to park my spirituality. I left the church. I was still a believer. They offered me a way to continue in my beliefs, and not just believing them and going to church once a week, but to actually live it. So that was the appeal. We're living the gospels, and so everything they taught me from the beginning, they would always back it up with a scripture. So they pull
Hmm.
out the Bible and show me verses. As I said, I never read the Bible, so this was very intriguing to me, for the first time, to actually see the Bible that the priest talked about and gave their sermons based on. But now I'm reading it for myself. And of course, scriptures can be twisted anyway, but of course, I didn't know that at the time. They could back up anything they said, all of their teachings, just by showing me in the Bible. So within probably, I think it was probably just 2 months at the most from the first meeting. I
Hmm.
decided to drop out. I decided to drop out of school, leave home, and join them.
So that's actually I think a really important point. This isn't simply a matter of you joining another church or finding a spiritual community that you felt comfortable with. When you say that you dropped out, you you're talking about dropping out of school,
Yep.
dropping out of society,
Yep.
and your entire world becomes
Yep.
uh, defined by the children of God. So can you
Yes.
talk about that process of essentially cutting yourself off from your family, from your community, from everything that you've known to join the children of God?
Yeah. And as I said, probably the most important element of that is what I just mentioned, how they backed up everything by showing me verses in the Bible.
Okay.
So, to give an example, in separating from your own personal family, there are verses in the New Testament, supposedly, the words of Jesus telling his disciples, um, and I'm paraphrasing because I had these verses memorized for years, and thankfully I'm slowly losing them. But there's verses that say that unless you hate your mother and father, you can't be one of my followers. Unless I mean, it says it like you can read it right there. Of course, most Christians don't interpret it literally as meaning you have to hate your parents.
Well, and isn't one of the Ten Commandments, which if you only know 10 things, you should know the Ten Commandments. One of them is to honor thy mother and thy father. So it's
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a good point because there's so many contradictions. Even when I was firmly in this and thoroughly indoctrinated, and if an outsider told me, "Well, the Bible, it's full of contradictions," I would just reject that. I could not see any contradictions whatsoever in the Bible. Of course, now, as I've recovered from all of that, I see them everywhere. And that's one that you just pointed out, this sort of contradiction. Although in the evolution of their teachings, um, and actually fairly from the beginning, if there was any kind of disputes or contradictions, they would always answer by citing Jesus' words again, where he talks about how when he's being questioned about the law, the Old Testament, and how that applies, he says, well, and again, these are words attributed to Jesus, that, well, all you need is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Those two things, all the laws are encapsulated in those two things. So in other words, you don't need the law anymore. You don't need the Old Testament. We're just going by love, loving God and loving your neighbor. And again, they would cite these very specific scriptures, right? So, and they, this group, like many, had a very deliberate indoctrination process. So, in the beginning, before I actually move in, they're just giving me the very basic Christian stuff, like very. They, again, to use cult terminology, they would consider me as a newborn Christian, as a babe, right? And
Mhm.
there's verses by Paul that talk about you give milk to babies, and you give strong meat to adults. And so when you're a new recruit in this group, they would just be very careful what they teach you until they're certain they've really captured you. And so that they actually had a 6-month process from the time a person joins.
So it was quite one of the things that surprised me when in reading your book as you describe it is just how planned and how deliberate the
Yeah,
process is. Like this is not just people going out and doing what they what feels right. Um, there's a plan, there's a system in place, it's documented, there's
yeah,
the letters, and there are rules. There are a lot of rules. One of the things that struck me, you wrote that one of the strictest rules is that no one went anywhere alone. So once you joined, you were
correct.
no longer able to do anything independently. Can you talk about the effect that has, or what it's like to be living in a where you essentially have no privacy? You never have a moment alone. You don't have the ability for independent
Yeah.
activity or thought.
Yeah, and that rule, the 2 by 2 rule, again backed up with very specific scriptures. There's one that talks about, if someone walks alone and falls, there's no one to help them. But when you go 2 by 2, your partner can, pick you up. So, and again, the organizational structure, they from the beginning they considered themselves an army. So this was the army of Christian soldiers, and so that's where the discipline comes in and the rules and the no privacy. I actually discuss one of the rules. There was a document that came out called the Revolutionary Rules, and it set out over time that was a 1 page document. Over the next decades, the list of rules, I mean, it just got massive, way more than the rules in the Old Testament. But I kind of use an example of one of the rules to speak to that issue we're talking about, where you have no privacy. So, everything's monitored. You don't go alone. It's always a group thing, and also group think. Everything is, you're conforming to one you know way of being. But there was a rule, and some of the rules were common sense, based on economics, because nobody worked. All of our money was donated, our food and stuff. We begged. Businesses helped us, so we had to walk. We had to scrimp and save on things. And there was a three sheet toilet paper rule. You were only allowed to use 3 sheets of toilet paper, right? to save money. Well, now that was now you're doing your business privately in the toilet. That was the only rule I ever broke. I mean, I just couldn't keep that rule. I was like, I don't know how to do that. But of course, nobody's in there monitoring me. So I sort of joke about how that was the only rule I could ever break. Because otherwise, you're being watched, and it's peer pressure thing. It's like everybody's watching each other, right? So um, and so there eventually, over time, they developed a system of reporting, and so that turned into a tool of control, where members would even report on each other if they were sinning or breaking rules. But in those early years, in that first 6 months of indoctrination, I mean, it just, I didn't even actually think about it. I mean, I was just caught up in the moment, and I was happy to just give up everything I owned, all my small possessions. I gave over to the group. I just bought in very quickly. And so I spent the first, I'd say about the first 2 to 3 months here in that commune I joined in Port Alberni. But and I was getting the basic indoctrination in classes. The next the second 3 months, so months 4, 5, and 6, that gets into the real deep indoctrination, where you learn the sort of the esoteric teachings. Because when I joined, I didn't know this that there was a cult leader we called him Mo, short for Moses David. His real name was David Berg. In the beginning, they didn't even tell, although they would read letters from him, they would just tell me that it was like an elder, that a wise elder that they got lessons from. I didn't learn that he was actually the founder and leader of this group until the second half of my indoctrination, where they start teaching us his beliefs, that he considered himself the end time prophet. So now I'm learning some very extra biblical stuff. In the beginning, it's all Bible based directly.
Right.
Now you get into the stuff that's unique about them.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. Let's. So you were raised Catholic, and they were obviously very Christian, and you have the Bible in common. But so far, we haven't really learned anything about what the children of God believe? Like, what makes them different from any other type of Protestant congregation? Right?
Right.
We've got a couple of their practices. They wall themselves off from society, but what are their what's the belief system
Right.
of the children of God? What do you accept to be true when you become a member or when you graduate from your 6 month probation period?
Right. So again, now we're talking about back in the 70s when I joined. That this kind of stuff sort of changes over the years, but at the time, um, what they did tell me and what I did know at the time was that this group was part of the wider Jesus People movement. So in the 60s, there was this charismatic movement among mainstream churches, including the Catholic Church, where they were starting to sort of open up ecumenically, where there would be cooperation between different denominations and churches, etc. And the Jesus People movement sort of grew out of that, where young people would form their organizations and they had different names for different Jesus People groups who were, again, youth who were sort of dissatisfied with the church system the way that I was, but they still worked with it. They would organize outside of the churches, but would still work with churches, and hadn't completely dropped out and lived communally. So now David Berg's in California when this is all happening. He has his four young teen children who he's trained to be evangelists, and they start preaching to the hippies on the beaches of California. They get a small gathering, and right from the beginning, Berg sort of denounces not just the churches but other Jesus People groups, and he says we're different. We're a revolution. We are the radical Christians. We are the new Christians for today. It's a revolution. And he came up with this call and response. He would shout revolution, and everybody would thrust their hand in the air for Jesus, using a three-finger salute, for the Trinity. So he right from the beginning he taught his followers that we're radical. We reject the churches. We are the truth. Like most cults, they present themselves as the sole arbiters of the truth, right? um, and um, coupled with his teachings that he was the end time prophet in a very elaborate um, set of predictions and prophecies and teachings, where he uses verses from the Old Testament and New Testament that talk about a King David in the latter time, and it couldn't be the biblical King David because these are referring to time after that. So
Mm-hmm.
there's this mention of a David in the end time. So now he's saying he's that prophet, that he speaks directly through God, speaks directly through him, that his own words were as important or even more important than the Bible. This is all stuff I was indoctrinated in very early. So
Well,
now
that's
we understand.
fascinating. So it's a little bit of a bait and switch here, right? Because at the beginning they say, "Here, you're obviously already a believer, which is
Yep,
great. They don't have to convince you,
yep,
but you're not familiar with the Bible, so everything that they tell you is true, and they prove it by showing you what's in the Bible. And
yep,
then once they have you, then you hear David Berg or Moses David, however you want to refer to him. He's the leader, and then he's taking your belief in the Bible as the foundation, but said actually I'm more than that, and then suddenly it's all about him and not the Bible anymore.
exactly. And from there, and this goes over many years. He would groom. I mean, that was a grooming process by him. To convince us. Like, in other words, you're not taught that from day one, right? You're not
Mm-hmm.
taught who he is. So it's a gradual process. And you've probably heard this sort of metaphor that's kind of used a lot. It's not really based in true biology, but the metaphor of the frog in the boiling pot, you know,
Yes.
that goes like if you put a frog in drop a frog in a pot of boiling water, it'll just immediately jump out. It senses the danger. But if you stick it in a pot of cold water and heat it up slowly, frog doesn't realize what's going on until it's too late. Now, I don't know if that's an actual biological fact, but it's a common metaphor people use to say, you when you get sucked into a cult or cult-like group, you don't even know it until it's too late. And so it did, like I say, after 6 months of indoctrination, outsiders could have said anything to me and I wouldn't believe it. I was now a true believer in David Berg, you know, and you know, and a part of the appeal, our communal lifestyle, you had an instant family of of fellow believers. That's part of the communal thing from the Book of Acts in the New Testament. All the believers lived together and had everything in common. So you give up everything you have. It's everything's for the group, and now it becomes groupthink. But yeah, um, so now he's convinced, a couple thousand followers by now, is early 70s. There was probably 2 to 3 thousand followers in the US and Canada. But he, right from the beginning, he was getting pressure from authorities related to parental concerns of this group, brainwashing their kids and stealing their kids. And so Berg was very security conscious. He never lived with it other than basically the first year. He lived separately from his followers. I never knew what he looked like until I left the cult, you know, 30 years later. He lived secretly, and big part of his message was to get out of North America because North America is going to be destroyed. There's going to be a World War III where America is destroyed, and from the ashes of that, this Antichrist is going to come out, through that war, which then leads to Jesus coming. And he had a very specific end time timeline where he discusses the last 7 years of world history, which ends in 1993 with Jesus coming back in 1993. That's an important thing because I firmly believe that, like through his
Hmm.
long series of predictions and prophecies, and that more than anything kept me in the cult as long as it did because I truly believed it until I didn't.
So we'll get to that, but let's just follow the timeline a little bit
Okay.
first, and so after your 6 months, they did keep their word in a sense, and you did get to see at least part of the world. So where did they send you, and can you tell us the places that you visited and what your life was like outside of Canada as part of the Children of God?
Right. So we had this big, fear of America being destroyed. I and some members were sort of setting up what we called survival camps, or you know, um, to stick it out in North America and try to survive the war in order to preach to the survivors. And that was me. I wanted to stay. But the leaders of the cult, they wanted to get as many members as possible overseas. For one thing, it was easier for all, to sort of skirt under the radar in other countries than it was in our home countries. So the big push to get us out. So I went to a commune in Washington State for a few months, and from there flew to Hawaii. Hawaii was a jumping off point where we were sending missionaries into the Far East, into Asia. So members who were in the States and Canada in the eastern North America, they were heading to Europe. Um, on the West Coast, we were heading to Asia. So this was all part of the plan and our mission, our end time mission. So from Japan, I went to Japan for a year. And during that year in Japan, went to South Korea a few times for visa trips. We most of us were in these foreign countries on tourist visas, so we were sort of restricted by our time there based on our visas. Japan, and by this time in the cult, we were now selling David Berg's writings as pamphlets. This was our main moneymaker. As I mentioned, when I first joined that first year or so, our only income was through donations from businesses and scavenging and that kind of stuff. Berg hits on the idea that instead of us being preachers on the street, he's the best preacher. So he'd put his teachings in pamphlets that we then sell on the street. This became very lucrative. Um, made millions over time, made millions and millions of dollars. So, which is how we survived. And so I spent a year in Japan, mostly on the road, traveling all over Japan, doing that very thing, just selling literature. I didn't even need to speak the local language. I just memorized, phrases like, hello, how are you? Would you like to read this pamphlet for a small donation? And I'd memorize it, and they'd, fork over money. From Japan, I spent the next 2 years in the Philippines. So now we're talking 75, 76. We had by this time they had a front organization that they were able to use to get missionary visas for certain countries. So I had a missionary visa for the Philippines, which is how I stayed there for so long. Um, then we don't have time to get into all the details of how that happened. I became disillusioned at that point with changes in the group. It was becoming very, very, rule based and just ridiculous rules and new leadership that was really harsh. I ended up running away from the commune while in Manila, and I actually spent my last year in the Philippines outside of the group. I
So you left the cult. Just a few years. You were in the cult
Yeah,
for a while, and then you became disillusioned, and you left. You lived in the Philippines on your own,
yep. For
completely outside of the influence of the family of God.
Yeah, so when that happened, I'd been in the cult for 4 years
Okay.
when I walked away. But I didn't want to go, and I had no money, so we didn't have our own money. When I did that, I did have, a, I'm guessing maybe $100 Canadian, maybe less at the time, based on literature I'd sold when I basically ran away from the cult. But I didn't want to, I had no way to get back to Canada, and I didn't want to anyway because North America was going to be destroyed. I'm still waiting for World War III.
Mhm.
I'm still a believer. I don't reject Berg's teachings. I'm just dissatisfied with the communal life and the leadership that was imposing really sort of arbitrary and capricious rules. And I just was fed up. So I spent a year in a remote island, Mindanao, where there was no communes at all. I basically lived off the hospitality of Filipino people who took me in for a year. That's why one of my the chapter where I write about that time in the Philippines, it's titled "Welcome to the Jungle" or "The Guest Who Wouldn't Leave," because I was taking advantage of this hospitality. My visa was running out. I couldn't stay. I couldn't figure out a way to stay in the Philippines. It was just impossible. So my parents borrowed some money to fly me home to Canada, a one-way ticket. And now I'm back in Port Alberni on Vancouver Island for another 2 years outside of the group.
Okay. So you've left the cult. You were in it for 4 years. You've left for three,
Yeah,
almost as long as you were in it.
yeah,
And then this was a huge twist, and I really want to understand your mindset, because then, after 3 years outside of the children of God,
yeah.
you voluntarily returned to it. There wasn't a someone, in a hood kidnapped you from your bed and brought you into a dark basement until you repented of your evil ways. You you voluntarily returned
Yes.
to the cult. So can you explain, having seen what they were like,
Yeah.
deciding to leave, what what made you decide to return?
Right. So, okay. So now, as I mentioned, during this period when I'm not living in a commune and have no contact with, members, I'm still a believer. I haven't rejected any of the group's teachings. I'm still a Christian. I still believe David Berg's a prophet. I still believe his predictions. I'm just not connected with them. I'm just kind of spinning my wheels, waiting for all these end time events to happen, you know. And so in that situation, at the summer of 1979, we're now at. I'm sitting I'm in a parking lot in a shopping mall. I'm waiting for a friend, and two people walk up to my car with literature. I know immediately who they are. It was two Children of God members. And I'd had no contact for 3 years. And they were on a road trip just passing through town. They actually had my parents' name in a notebook. So when I told them, oh, I used to be with you guys, they got excited. They go, oh, are you Bulwer? Are you Perry Bulwer? Because my parents had stayed friends, sort of friendly relationships with the group when I was in it. So the cult had their names, and so anyway, I take them home. They're there for a night, and they start talking to me about how things have changed in the group. The situation that I escaped, this harsh leadership and the changes, had had resulted in a major reorganization in the group. David Berg fired like 300 leaders in around the world. He says, I'm taking direct control now. It's gotten out of hand. So he had this whole series of letters about how the group has changed. And the group actually sent out a letter to all the former members who they had contact information for, begging them to return. We're sorry for, if you had encountered some harsh leadership. We got rid of them. We're different. We've changed. Please come back. So after I met these people, they gave me the names of two families, one here on Vancouver Island in another city, and one in Vancouver. So I decided to go visit them, each of those homes. And it was true. A lot of things had changed. It no longer meant you had to live communally. There was all these different changes, and just got sucked back in. I mean, part of it was what I was experiencing in my life here in Port Alberni. I was going nowhere. I had these, dead end jobs. I wasn't happy. I didn't fit in. I never talked about my cult past to anybody. That was a total secret. So I was just, like I say, it was all these different ingredients, And as I open the book, I tell an anecdote from this time, the middle of my story. I open the book with it. I'm I'm in my car, got the car radio on. A Bob Dylan song comes on. You got to serve somebody. And I'm listening to those. I was shocked. I pull over the car. I'm like, what? He's paraphrasing Bible verses that I learned in the cult. You know, you got to serve somebody. No man can serve two masters. You either serve God or mammon. And I was like blown away. And I took that as a sign. Like I saw that's a sign from God. God's talking to me through the radio. He's talking to me through Dylan. You got to serve somebody. You got to go back. So it was all these different factors, and I did. I actually ended up taking the train from Vancouver to Halifax. Going straight across Canada because that's where one of the two people I met in Port Alberni, the woman was now living in Halifax, and she had written me a couple letters enticing me to come back. So I did. I rejoined the group by taking the train across Canada and joining their commune in Halifax. Yeah, so yeah, that's how I ended up going back into the group.
And you remained there for another 20 or so years. Is that
No,
right? Oh,
no, no.
sorry, another 15 or so years.
Yeah, it's more like when I calculate the actual time, it comes down to about 19 years. So, yeah, about roughly another 15 years. So I finally left for good in 1991. So I had rejoined. So basically, at the beginning of 1980. So 11 years. The math, writing this book, the timelines and the math, like the years, it's something like, yeah, yeah, I guess I count 19 years in the cult because in my mind I never left it. Although physically I left it, those 3 years or so I was outside of communal living. I was still trapped in the cult mentality. So I kind of calculate that as still being part of the cult, even though I wasn't actively.
Okay.
That's how it works.
All right. Okay. So there's a lot that happens, and if people want to find out the details, then I strongly recommend getting your book Misguided and reading that. But what I would like to focus on is you're back in the cult. It becomes your whole life. You've dedicated a huge portion of it. What prompted you to leave the second time?
Right. So um, basically, after a number of events and new doctrines came out, I began to have doubts. And doubts were right from my initial indoctrination. We were told doubts are of the devil. You know, do you can't doubt. Don't let doubt into your life. It's the opposite of critical thinking. Where doubting and questioning is key to
Hmm.
critical thinking. The key to groupthink is do not question and don't doubt and never dispute. You just so what the things that were happening. I was beginning to see that life for the children that were born into this group was it I was beginning to become aware of abuses that, for the most part, I didn't recognize as abuse initially. Now, in hindsight, I see everything about the way the children were raised as abusive from birth, basically. But it took time for me while I was still immersed in that environment to see it. But things didn't sit right with me the way that there was corporal punishment, for example, was very strong and cruel. And I'd heard about a suicide of a 13-year-old teen who had lived in one of the communes I did, and that was all hushed up, and that made me wonder and doubt. Well, what would make a 13-year-old in this supposedly loving family environment commit suicide? Um, and then there was a, a series of letters describing extreme abuse of David Berg's granddaughter. Um, because she lived with him and knew the truth about him. He was a sexual predator. He was an abusive person. He was a pedophile. He was an alcoholic. This was all secret to most members because he lived separately. But she knew the truth. And so they punished her through a series of extreme exorcisms. And they published the details of this treatment of her as a warning for other children and teens, but also for everybody. Here's what happens if you step out of line. Here's what happens if you doubt the prophet. Here's what happens if you question the prophet. It was shocking to read those letters. I mean, they described that, being surrounded by adults beating her and these prayers. It was just vicious. And I didn't know how to deal with that. I mean, that was like, it was like any questions or doubts that I had that would pop up, I just stick them in the back of my mind. I would describe it in the book as this box in the back of my mind where I just pushed everything that I couldn't make sense of or had questions or doubts about. And I kept hoping Jesus will come back soon and all these, everything will be answered. But I ended up in a situation in Macau, which at the time was a Portuguese colony. It's now part of mainland China. In this commune that was a detention center for teens, so-called delinquent teens who caused trouble or questioned, And this granddaughter, Mary, was sent there, and I saw her in person. And I saw some of her mistreatment that shocked me to the core. I didn't know how to deal with it. And it was like I consider that point, that event, as the triggering event that led me to try to figure out how to get out. I mean, I had to find a way to escape and while living overseas in foreign countries with no money and not speaking the language. So, but that was a turning point. I because I saw the mistreatment, abuse of other teens there as well. So those experiences, coupled with some of David Berg's new doctrines that were coming out. For example, he came up with this bizarre idea that heaven is inside the moon. And I really why I thought that was more bizarre than any of his other teachings, I don't know, but I had a hard time swallowing that. And also by now we're in the late 1980s, 89, 90.
So you're approaching the end time.
Exactly. All these signs that he said should be happening, the rise of the Antichrist, all these things that should be happening were not happening. And he was starting to revise his predictions and say, well, it did, well, if the Antichrist he taught was going to be known publicly to everybody, now he was saying, well, no, he's here, but just secretly behind the scenes. He's starting to change, and all those doubts plus the abuses that just came to a head, and that's when I got to find a way, and I made this elaborate plan and escape to get out.
Yeah, I found it fascinating how things evolved with the voluminous letters from Mo. So he wasn't with you physically.
Right.
David Berg kept secret and private, and you've explained why. Obviously, that was necessary, but the communication was constant and seemed to come, at least from reading your book, it seemed like there were a torrent of letters and communications and rules and how things were doing. Like he managed to keep a fairly close control,
Yeah.
even from a distance.
Yeah. He taught that very early on, when he declared, even as early as early 70s, that his words were God's words. He taught it was more important to read his letters than to read the Bible. Yeah, so like you say, there was more than you could actually read in terms of his letters and documents. It kept your mind focused on that, and you had no other input from any other sources, no outside sources at all. It was just the group think and teach, and which is why when I describe when I finally leave and escape, I spent the next few months in the library constantly because I was intellectually starving. Right? I mean,
Mhm.
all we had was his words, and that's how he controlled people. And then there was control through peer pressure and spiritual pressure. I didn't have children myself. Most members had many children, a dozen or more children. One way of controlling members was to keep parents separated from their kids and then threaten they'd never see them again if they step out of line. So there's a lot of ways to coercively, spiritually control members in the group, which is why I describe it as escaping from that. You can walk out of any commune at any time, but you're in mental, psychological, spiritual chains, and you've got to break out of those. So yeah, I mean, that's, like I say, it was an elaborate plan to get out. And even then, what the chapter I describe it is called "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" Even then, I was in this indecision. I come back to Canada. 2, 3 weeks later, I go back to Japan. Not to go back to the cult. My plan was to rescue a Japanese woman I had fallen in love with. That plan fell apart. I wasn't allowed in the country, and I'm back in Canada. And that's when my journey of recovery started, 1991.
And I want to actually, that's a perfect segue of how I want to conclude our conversation. And I want to talk about your recovery, and the because even when you left,
Yep,
that it had you, that was nearly 20 years of your
yep,
life,
yep,
and the your final chapter was a very, at least for me reading it, an emotional gut punch.
yeah,
It was very hard to read. I can only imagine how difficult it might have been to write.
yep.
Can you explain for our listeners your road to recovery and the lasting effects that your nearly 2 decades in the Children of God had on
Right.
the rest of your life?
Yeah. So my recovery happened in two stages over a 13-year period. So when I immediately left the cult, as I said, I was spending hours and hours in the library reading books and wondering, well, what do I do with my life now? I was mid 30s, no money, no skills, no education. A series of serendipitous events lead me to go to university. Exactly a year after I left the group in 91, so 92, I enter university at what's now called Vancouver Island University, and that was what I needed in terms of recovering from my religious indoctrination. So that's the first step. I overcame my religious beliefs. The second stage I'll get to is about my understanding of the whole cult life and processes and recovery from that. But just um, in terms of my religious beliefs, at first I just I didn't stop believing. I just put it on hold. I didn't know what to believe anymore. I'm in confusion. So those 4 years of university were perfect because I was reading all kinds of books and studying things that just opened my mind. Um, and actually, my very first semester, I read a book that wasn't on my course list. I just happened to see it in the library and it intrigued me. And it was called God is Red. And it's by a very famous indigenous lawyer, activist in the US. And this book discusses indigenous religious beliefs and comparing them to Christianity because he was also a theologian, and it was the first time I'd ever considered any sort of view that criticized the Bible. So that opened my mind to enable to question my beliefs, and one thing led to another. In the group, we were young Earth creationists. David Berg taught, a fundamentalist literal translation of the Bible, meaning the world's only 6,000 years old or something. Evolution's the big lie. So
Hmm.
when I read Charles Darwin directly, or The Origin of Species, that blew my mind. I was like, that was the aha moment. I was like, oh, this is how it could work. And evolution made way more sense. So through that education, I just rejected all my Christian beliefs, my religious beliefs. I now consider myself an agnostic atheist. I'm an atheist in practice, but there's that, agnostic little bit there that's probably maybe wise to hang on, but I don't believe there's a God. But then, so now I'm in recovery mode. I'm studying. I have to survive financially. I end up going to Vancouver, getting involved in social justice issues. I go to law school at UBC as a result of this, advocacy for drug users and street prostitutes. I wanted to learn how the law works. I wasn't even thinking of cult stuff at the time. So I go to law school. During this 13-year period, um, ending in 2004 or 2003 when I'm finally called to the bar, um, I I had this compulsion to write my story, but I didn't know it enough. I needed to learn more about it. So every time I have memories, I'd write stuff down. I had about a dozen notebooks filled with memories and notes. My plan was to one day write a book. So I get called to the bar. I'm working at a law firm. My future's undecided. I decided now's the time. I'm just going to work part time and write a book. So 2004, I start going onto the internet. Up till now, I'd never gone on the internet to look up the cult and see what they were up to. I was burying that past. I never talked about it. Now I go on the internet and I discover so much stuff, not just stuff I didn't know about when I was in it, but all the horrific stuff that has happened since I left, meaning a lot of child abuse, and now survivors had created a couple websites revealing and exposing all these crimes and abuses committed by the cult and all these abuse stories. I basically had a nervous breakdown. I could, like, I was just shattered knowing that I'd been part of this group that had caused so much damage to thousands of people who were born and raised in it. You know, this second generation, third generation, they suffered a lot and they still suffered. Um, I didn't know where to go for help. I went, tried various places. Nobody could understand me when I said, I need help. I was in a cult. That just went over people's heads. What are you talking about? Anyway, I ended up getting diagnosed with PTSD through, Vancouver General Hospital. Having um, therapy for that, group therapy really helped me understand it. I then started reading books about cults to understand the process. Like I had to ask this question: how did I end up in a this a group led by this horrible man that mistreated thousands of children? How did I end up in the group? Why did I stay so long? How come I didn't recognize child abuse when I for what it was, for what I saw? Like what was going on? So I had to really study all about cult dynamics to understand that process. And it was through that and my interactions with many of these second generation survivors in trying to help them and advocate for them that I finally came to a fuller understanding of that entire life, and just became, and I decided, well, part of my way of making up for that and for being part of that was to help these people get their stories out, to speak, not speak for them, but to amplify their voices, which meant taking on numerous academic scholars of sociology and religion who had defended the cult in the name of religious freedom. But they ignored the stories of abuse survivors, claiming, well, they're exaggerating, they're just apostate stories, etc. That infuriated me. So I took some of that on. I wrote an academic article published by the International Cultic Studies Association. And then, through all of that, my I got serious once again in writing my book as a way of telling that story. So my book it's a strange mix of, it's a hybrid of like not many memoirs have 400 endnotes. You know what I mean? I wanted to document everything because I knew that that there was an academic element to this book. So I discussed some of that process in the book. And yeah, so that's how I got to where I am with this book. I felt I had to get my story out there in order to get their stories out there, to
Right.
say, yes, I believe you, this happened, this supports all of these survivors.
And one of the I have to say that when I was reading your book, I had a certain expectation because I thought I'd heard the story before,
Yeah.
and when you had left the cult, and I thought I was going to read about how even at such a tremendous disadvantage of having lost two of your prime decades of life. You
Yeah.
put the pieces back together, and it would kind of be a redemption arc, and really make your life wonderful again. And I want to quote you at in your the last page or so of the main part of your book,
Yeah.
when you hear everything is broken on the radio,
Right.
and you describe broken family, broken relationships, and describe exactly how the legacy of the cult has led to broken family and broken relationships, and how you never recovered your relationship with your dad and other loved ones, broken social scene, broken love, and again you describe how all of that happens, broken finances, broken future, broken health, broken hope. And then your final paragraph is, you know what, I think I'll just read it. One
Sure.
day when I was about 5 or 6 years old, we discovered our dog hiding under the house. She was injured, probably hit by a car. I remember hearing an adult explain that some dogs do that when they are sick or injured. Sometimes, when the pain caused by my dogmatic past is at its worst, I remember that dog as I'm curled up, alone, in a semi-secluded log cabin, licking my wounds. And that real I found that to be an incredibly powerful passage, and really brought home to me how uh, some wounds just don't heal, or they stay there
Yeah.
for the rest of your life, and your suffering has,
Yeah.
at least based on what you've written here, your suffering
Yeah.
hasn't ended, as a result of your experiences in the children of God.
Yes, and it's important for me to note here that that pain and suffering um, that I experience, I think, is much higher in the second generation survivors. So much so that there's been an ongoing epidemic of suicides within that cohort. In fact, in the last month, there's been two more. And it's an ongoing thing. While many of them have survived and even thrived in their new lives, many others haven't. And even those who have thrived, physically, good jobs, everything's fine. The damage, the scars, the psychological scars are there. And this speaking out is for some of us and many of them as part of our recovery. It's how we recover and overcome. And I just want to point out this sad ending. And there was a very purposeful. It was very purposeful for me to end not with this redemption story. If you recall the chapter where I'm in China, and
Hmm.
I talk about movies and censorship and how because the communists censored all their movies, but so did we in the cult. And David Berg wrote a letter about movies, happy endings. We were only allowed to watch movies that had happy endings.
Right.
If a movie had a sad ending, no, you can't watch that. And I was actually thinking of that when I wanted, like, this story doesn't have a happy ending in that sense. I mean, there are some good things that come out of it and some victories and etc. But yeah, it this is an experience that scars people. And you, yeah,
Well, Perry Bulwer, I want to thank you for writing the book, Misguided. And I want to thank you for coming on to Podcast for Inquiry. Are there any last words, any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience today?
no, I'm just thankful that you give me this opportunity. As I said, I think this book is more than just my own story, and so I think it's a very important one. It's very rare, actually, for male cult survivors to write memoirs. Most of them are by women, and so there's a sort of a unique perspective here. So I just hope that this will help, you know, get more people interested in this subject because cults today are still with us. In fact, In the epilogue, I make the point of circling back to the 60s when I described the 60s and the events in the world that were part of my joining a cult, the Cold War, the environmental crisis, Now I end the book by pointing out today, those things, those issues are even worse. Young people have great anxieties like we did back in the 60s, and there are more cults in the world today than ever, something like 30,000. So it's a reader, a cautionary tale, to don't be misguided like I was.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate you speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Okay, thank you very much.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please show your support at patreon.com/podcast4inquiry and give us a 5-star review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter or X at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.